Hi there, everyone. My name is Darlene Yamauchi, and I belong to the Faculty of Foreign Languages at Bunkyo Gakuin University here in Tokyo. Today, I'm going to be talking about inclusive education through SDGs and the pedagogical strategies for CLIL. So first of all, um, I'll give you a brief idea of what I'm going to be talking about today. And basically, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the principles of inclusive education. And then I'd like to talk briefly about the situation in Japan and CLIL in the Japanese education tertiary system. Then I'm going to give you a lesson development that I did with a textbook that I made and the reflective process. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact and the challenges of using SDGs within inclusive education. So, as most of you know, Japan is historically being an ethnically, culturally homogeneous society. And in fact, even as recent as 2022, over 97% of the population is ethnically Japanese with a shared language, tradition, norms, and that shaped the national identity. And in fact, it is a source of pride for Japanese people, and so it should be. But recently, especially post-pandemic, the situation is that the Japanese society population is becoming more diverse. One of the reasons, of course, is the inbound of tourism. But even more so than that, there has been an incredible increase in foreign residents. In fact, there are more than 3.5 million foreign residents in Japan as recent as 2024 statistics. Um, and as a result, of course, there are more children, there are more reasons for schools to sort of cash into having this foreign enrollment. So there has been a market increase in EMI and bilingual programs in Japan. Um, if you're interested in this subject, actually, Galloway is definitely an interesting read. Furthermore, the workforce has become increasingly globalized as well. And there's a lack of, as you know, anybody who goes to a Japanese convenience store now, you will see there are many, many foreign workers working even in that industry, not to mention all different industries like ours as well. So when you look at that situation, um, inclusive education is going to become more and more of an issue and an important point in Japanese education for a whole host of reasons. But when you look at inclusive education, one of the most important things is equitable access. So everyone should have access to education, regardless of their background, ability, or their learning needs. And how to get that, one very, very useful methodology is scaffolding and differentiation. So supporting students, providing an outlet for them and a way for them to develop independence while also learning the content and language that is necessary especially when you're looking at something like CLIL. If you look at students with learning needs as opposed to special needs, then it kind of puts it in a better sort of context or perspective, in my opinion. And one of the most important issues with that, as Sean mentions in 1983, which is not a recent finding. So inclusive education has definitely been something that needs to be continually thought about, and it's more than, 40 years in the making. So reflective teaching practice, and it is so very important, as you know. Um, we have to constantly update what we're doing. We have to constantly look at what we're doing. We have to think about what the students know, what they don't know, what we're not giving them, what we're giving them too much of. There's all of these things. And with reflective teaching practice, you are in a much better situation to help students improve and adapt to their needs. And what better way than with CLIL? As you know, CLIL is content language integrated learning. It uses content and language together in a balance of some description, depending on whether the student's content is higher than their language ability. It's sort of a kind of a balancing act. Um, it supports bilingual education, so students can have a meaningful content-based language usage in the classroom. As well, it encourages active learning, which I think all of us would like to see our students more actively engaged in the classroom. So looking at CLIL in that respect in the Japanese tertiary education system, one of the ways that CLIL is very useful and is very easily implemented is looking at something like SDGs. So Sustainable Development Goals have a large pool of authentic, interesting content at various different levels of language proficiency, intellectual content proficiency. It's a very useful area to look at. And with that, inclusivity is one of the sort of most important issues within SDGs. So this is another way that students can become more attuned to the idea of equality in various ways. So the most important thing that I think that we look at in CLIL quite often is how to give students some sort of authenticity, how to make it real for them. If it's real for them, then in fact, they may become more interested and it may engage them in more meaningful learning. Yes. So I'm just briefly talk about the sort of the research, my research focused methodology with this using SDGs and in this CLIL context. Basically, if you look at action research approach, that's probably a very good place to start in looking at how to look at your reflection, to reflect on your teaching practice. Also, SDG SDG driven CLIL lessons have a great deal of authenticity in terms of, as I mentioned previously, that the learning experience becomes more meaningful. And if you look at research from Prezzo Kondo, you can see that this is one of the hallmark or one of the most important, or one of the important things that you should look at with regards to CLIL as well. As well, it increases communicative competence, content mastery. If you can get authenticity in your classroom, then the students become more and more interested in the topic. It becomes something that perhaps they're more interested in talking about, writing about, or working with regards to your class. Um, and within the CLIL context, there are so many textbooks right now available. So the materials are there. It's nothing that you have to search for. A lot of it is basically oriented to certain levels in certain streams. So, for example, a textbook that myself and my colleague Justin Jenkins made called CARE. It's looking at sustainable development goals with health awareness. So we wrote it for a health and welfare university because that was what we were interested in, and we couldn't really find a textbook at that time. But there are a lot of textbooks that, with regard to SDGs and certain content. So by all means, take a look. This is an example of a lesson that came from CARE. And basically, this lesson is talking about origami, which is very authentic. And for students, most Japanese students are aware of origami. And even if you have international students in your class, for example, or if it is a class of students who are not Japanese, origami is a wonderful, wonderful way to use content, language, kinesthetic intelligence, if you're interested in multiple intelligences. It's a very interesting way. It also connects real world knowledge to SDGs. So when you look at something like origami and mental health, you can see that origami is something particularly in this lesson. I won't get into too much details, but talking about origami and the elderly and how to use that as a way to increase your mental stimulation, fine motor dexterity, things like that. So basically, this particular lesson would have been geared to probably how health and well-being, the SDG involved with that. So if you look at it, the contents and objectives, so the real world knowledge, the SDGs, so talking about mental health awareness, talking about the elderly in this particular class, it's to do with health and welfare, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the class that the major of study. It also, in terms of it encourages active learning and communication. This is what you always want in your classroom. And it's inclusive for different learning styles. And I'll explain a little bit about that in terms of, for example, making an origami heart. So a student who likes to use their hands to learn, it may be a good listening activity for them. It may be a good speaking activity for them because they're using their hands. They're also using, it's very sort of spatial. So they're looking at pictures perhaps. If they're a linguistic learner, they can read about it and then do it. You can have discussions about origami and the health benefits. That definitely leads into a lot of the content area, and reading and vocabulary. Again, looking at health-related terms, fine motor skills, stress relief, memory, et cetera, like all of these things definitely are a balance in a CLIL classroom. So the idea of the language and the content. And it's also fun. And it's something, again, that most students are very well aware of. Although I will admit that some of my students in the beginning, they were like, I haven't done origami since I was a kindergarten student. So some of them had a little bit of a challenge to start. But I will say that that is a very interesting class for my students anyway. So the idea to have an inclusive classroom, scaffolding is one of the main tools. And some of the ways that this can be done, and again with the lesson that I just spoke about, is pre-teaching the vocabulary. Again, if we were going to do origami, the students could have seen the diagram. There could have been some visual aids. You could use a YouTube video. There are all kinds of different ways to sort of help with the scaffolding of how to do content for the whole classroom, language education for the whole classroom, making the tasks at different levels, which again is not as difficult as it would sound, especially now that we have all of these tools in our toolbox. We can use the internet, we can use AI, we can use all of these different areas to help students at different levels come up to the same or even surpass what you expect. It's very important to tap into what students are interested in my opinion. And then, of course, the role of reflective practice. So you've done this. Okay, so how did it go? You have to be honest with yourself. Watch the students as much as you can. I have an iPad that I walk around in the classroom, and I do document the students because sometimes I may not exactly interpret what the students' difficulties were. So looking back on the videos or looking back on the audio that I've collected is often very helpful. Then also too, it can only be a couple of minutes when they're going out the door. You can think of a couple of questions you might want to ask the students. So did you find the class difficult? How was it? They may just say, oh, it was great and leave, or they just may not say anything and leave. But if you have specific questions, was the vocabulary difficult? How did you do with how did you do with the role play? If you ask a few questions, you would be surprised at the answers that you get from students. And then you can modify your classes quite easily from that standpoint, because you can get the students' feedback and move forward in that way. So yeah, so I guess the practical takeaways for me, I think, is scaffolding and differentiation. You have to scaffold the classes, you have to reflect, you have to adjust. And I think that for us, it's not as difficult as maybe for other subjects, because with English, it seems that because of the sort of the changing in the content, we've always have to be a little bit faster. Um, yes, and the thing is about SDGs is it's a very familiar subject. So inclusive education using SDGs, it's a no-brainer, really. So here are some example topics. Food security and waste. These are all topics that students are maybe learning in other classes. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization between content and language, even within that realm, even within other classes. So if you look at some of these topics, you could probably see that they're doing them in other classes as well. The impact and the challenges basically that I've seen well, since we made CARE, that textbook, so that would be about 5 years, I guess, is it seems to increase students' motivation, like even outside of class, like they're interested, which is great. And develop global competencies. And that is so important right now with this whole sort of globalization, internationalization, the increase in the foreign workforce, as I mentioned, and just the increase of international students. Even in our small university, we have had a lot of new international students, particularly post-COVID. And it's inclusive. So the students do not feel like if they're concerned about their language ability, their content ability, with CLIL, there's always a little bit of a challenge there between content and language. And that's something that we have to be very resonant of. So for example, I have to say that most of the comments from the students have been very positive. For example, here's just two comments actually. So it was different from just learning English from a textbook. It felt real and useful. So the authenticity is really coming out there. The student feels that this is useful and feels that they're not just practicing, a role play, that this is something that is something that is of use to them, is something that is real. And then also sort of this other student who said, I liked how we talked about real issues again, this authenticity, and it made English more interesting and meaningful. So definitely it seems, well, at least from these two comments, and in fact, other students, much of the same actually. The students seem to enjoy at this authenticity. And even if it's just a local authenticity, meaning it's not a global issue. It's something in their local community or even within their school. Using SDGs is a very, very useful content to tap into. But of course, there are challenges, and again, student resistance to new topics, especially first year students who are coming in from high school who have been taught the exact same way forever. This whole resistance to sort of like, not being passive learners as opposed to being active learners, and also to the idea that the topics may be new to them, there may be a bit of resistance. But again, with scaffolding, bringing the issue to the student's level, I certainly think that that is something that can be overcome very easily. Also, too, the content and the language has to be balanced. And if one is more difficult than the other, then the scaffolding has to come into play. The biggest thing, and in fact, it's with this presentation right now, is time constraints and also syllabus planning. So sometimes I hear from instructors in our university, I've got this syllabus planned. We can't change it. And I'm like, well, no, you don't have to change it. You can work within your current syllabus, particularly if you're using scaffolding techniques or if you are using more content this week, you use more language next week and bring it up to the same level, bring it up to similar levels. So I sincerely believe that using SDGs, and especially in the Japanese CLIL context, in our university context, is very, very useful for inclusivity because students are again developing global competencies, and they're becoming more aware of how to deal in within this international society. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions whatsoever, or if you would like a list of references from my talk, please contact me at dmauchi@bgu.ac.jp. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the conference organizers. And next time, hopefully I can present in person. Many thanks.